January 17th, 1968. Somewhere in the central highlands of Vietnam, a 19-year-old kid from Queens is about to change the course of an entire offensive. He has no combat training. He has no map. He has no backup. His job description says food service specialist. In plain English, he cooks eggs. But in the next 12 hours, this terrified teenager will accidentally discover the largest enemy ammunition depot in the region, trigger the most devastating airstrike in Third Corps history, and save an estimated 300 American lives. His name is James Castelliano. And nobody, not even James himself, had any idea what he was capable of until the jungle decided to test him. This is the story of how a lost cook became an accidental hero. And trust me, what happens next will change everything you think you know about courage under fire. To understand why Castelliano's discovery matters, you have to understand just how badly American forces were losing the intelligence war in early 1968. The Central Highlands of South Vietnam was a tactical nightmare, unlike anything the U.S. military had ever faced. This was not the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta, where you could see your enemy coming. This was not the coastal cities where buildings provided clear lines of sight. This was pure, unforgiving jungle. Triple canopy, mountains rising from nowhere. Vegetation so thick that aerial reconnaissance was essentially useless. The Ho Chi Minh Trail snaked through neighboring Laos and Cambodia, like an invisible highway funneling men and material into staging areas hidden beneath canopies so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. General William Westmoreland's entire strategy relied on finding and destroying enemy supply lines. Cut the supplies, starve the enemy, win the war. Simple in theory. Impossible in practice. Because the North Vietnamese had perfected the art of concealment over 23 years of continuous warfare. They did not need satellites. They did not need computers. They needed patience, and they had plenty of it. American commanders threw everything at the problem. Infrared photography that cost millions of dollars. Seismic sensors buried along suspected trails. Chemical defoliants that stripped entire hillsides bare. Long-range reconnaissance patrols sent into the green hell for days at a time. Indigenous tracker teams who knew the jungle like Americans knew their own backyards. The results were marginal at best. A December 1967 intelligence assessment delivered devastating news. U.S. forces were interdicting less than 15% of enemy supplies moving through the region. The other 85% simply vanished into the jungle. The human cost was staggering. Between November 1967 and January 1968, Firebase Susan's area of operations recorded 73 enemy attacks. Sniper harassment, mortar barrages, full battalion-level assaults that came screaming out of the darkness. Casualty reports documented 42 Americans killed and 137 wounded. The enemy attacked with seeming impunity. Their ammunition supplies appeared limitless. Every patrol returned with the same frustrating report. Contact made, casualties sustained. Enemy withdrew. No cache found. Colonel Thomas Henderson, Firebase. Susan's brigade commander put it bluntly in a January 10th staff meeting. "We are fighting blind. Charlie moves supplies past us every night, and we are counting muzzle flashes." His intelligence officer estimated at least 6 major ammunition depots within 20 kilometers of the firebase. Finding even one would require extraordinary luck. But luck was about to walk through the door in the form of a terrified cook who had absolutely no business being in the jungle at all. James Paul Castelliano grew up in Astoria, Queens, where his father, Rosario, ran a neighborhood Italian restaurant called Rosario's. From age 12, Jimmy worked the kitchen every summer. Prep cook, dishwasher, eventually working the line during Friday dinner rush when orders came in faster than he could think. He knew his way around a commercial kitchen the way a musician knows scales. It was instinct. It was muscle memory. It was home. He did not know his way around a war zone. His army recruiter had painted a straightforward picture. Learn a skill. Serve your country. Use the GI Bill for college. When Castelliano saw food service specialist on the list of available jobs, it felt like fate. He had been cooking since he was tall enough to reach the stove. Why not get paid for it? His brother Marco had done 2 tours with the 123rd Airborne and come home with shrapnel scars and nightmares that made him scream in his sleep. Jimmy wanted no part of that. He wanted to serve his time, stay clean, and get back to his father's restaurant on Steinway Street. Cooking eggs for soldiers seemed like a reasonable compromise between duty and survival. Basic training at Fort Dix was unremarkable. Advanced individual training at Fort Lee focused on field kitchen operations and large-scale meal preparation. Castelliano learned to cook for 200 soldiers using portable equipment. He learned proper storage temperatures for perishable items in tropical climates. He learned sanitation protocols and menu planning. He did not learn land navigation. He did not learn small unit tactics. He fired his M16 rifle exactly 3 times during his entire training cycle. Once to zero the weapon, twice to qualify. He scored 22 out of 40 targets, just barely passing. When his orders came through for Vietnam, his father sat him down in the restaurant's back office. "You keep your head down," Rosario said. "You stay with the cooks. You do not volunteer for nothing." "You understand me nothing," Jimmy promised. His brother gave different advice. "Forget what they taught you. Over there, everybody is infantry. You learn to move, you learn to shoot, or you learn to die." Jimmy deployed in October 1967. His job at Firebase Susan was exactly what he trained for: operating the mess hall, preparing meals for 350 soldiers, managing food inventory. It was hot, exhausting work in a tin-roofed building that baked like an oven. But it was safe. The Firebase had sandbags, concertina wire bunkers, and artillery. Jimmy fell into a routine. Wake at 04:30, start the coffee, prep breakfast, lunch, dinner, letters home, sleep, repeat. Then Colonel Henderson ordered hot meals delivered to forward positions, and Jimmy Castelliano's war changed forever. January 17, 1968 begins like any other supply run. 2 trucks. Mermite cans full of scrambled eggs, bacon, and coffee. Castelliano rides in the passenger seat, his M16 propped between his knees. He is wearing a flak jacket that does not fit and a helmet that keeps sliding forward. The ambush happens at 08:47 hours, 3 kilometers from the landing zone. The first indication is a metallic crack that his brain does not immediately recognize as gunfire. Then, the windshield spiderwebs. The driver screams something incomprehensible and floors the accelerator. The truck fishtails on the muddy road. The passenger door pops open. Castelliano had never properly latched it. And then, he is falling. Tumbling through air. Hitting elephant grass taller than a man. Rolling. The breath knocked clean out of his lungs. When his vision clears, the trucks are gone. He can hear engine noise fading into distance, accompanied by rifle fire. He lies still in the grass, his heart trying to pound its way out of his chest. After what feels like an hour, but is probably 90 seconds, the shooting stops. Castelliano takes inventory. Bruised but uninjured. Rifle found after 30 seconds of panicked searching. Helmet gone. 2 magazines of ammunition. A canteen. And absolutely no idea where he is. He decides to move deeper into the jungle until he is clear of the kill zone. Then parallel the road back toward Firebase Susan. It is a plan born of panic rather than training. 2 hours later, he is utterly lost. The jungle is dense to the point of claustrophobia. Towering trees strangled by vines. Undergrowth so thick he has to force his way through. He tries to use the sun for direction, but the canopy is too thick. He tries to find the road again, but every direction looks identical. And that is when he hears voices, Asian voices, speaking Vietnamese. He freezes, drops to a crouch, and through a gap in the vegetation, he sees them. 30 soldiers, weapons stacked, wooden crates being unloaded into camouflaged bunkers, an ammunition depot so large it could supply an entire division, and not a single American knows it exists. Castelliano watches for 7 minutes, barely breathing. Then he backs slowly away. It takes 40 minutes of careful movement before he is confident he is out of earshot. Then he does something that will become legendary. He climbs a tree. The hardwood rises perhaps 80 feet, its upper branches breaking through the canopy. Castelliano is not a climber. The last time he scaled anything higher than a stepladder was age 12, retrieving a baseball from a neighbor's roof. But desperation is a powerful motivator. He slings his rifle across his back and climbs. 20 feet up, his arms are shaking. 40 feet up, he refuses to look down. 60 feet up, he breaks through into sunlight and can suddenly see for miles. There to the northeast is Fire Base Susan, perhaps 5 kilometers distant. He can see the radio antennas, the perimeter wire, the tin roofs. He memorizes landmarks and climbs back down with palms raw and bleeding. It takes 3 hours to reach the firebase. He approaches carefully, terrified that nervous sentries will shoot him. When he starts describing what he found, the reaction is immediate. Disbelief. The sergeant of the guard cuts him off. "Son, you are telling me you found a regiment-sized ammunition depot, you a cook who has been lost all morning." Castelliano insists on speaking to the intelligence officer. Captain Richard Byrne looks at the torn uniform and scratched face. He pulls out a map. "Show me." Castelliano points to a spot approximately 4 kilometers west-southwest. "That area has been reconned," Byrne says. "First platoon swept that sector 3 weeks ago. Found nothing. You are a cook private. No offense, but you do not have training to assess enemy positions. You probably saw a trail watch. 4 or 5 guys with rifles. The room erupts with agreement. The matter is effectively dismissed." Then Colonel Henderson walks in. He has been listening from the doorway. "How sure are you, son?" "100%, sir. It is there." Something in Henderson's expression shifts. Maybe it is the certainty in Castelliano's voice. Maybe it is desperation in his eyes. Or maybe it is decades of experience recognizing truth when he hears it. Captain Byrne requests a reconnaissance flight. 1 pass. "This sector. If there is something there, we will see it." The OV-1 Bird Dog launches at 14:20 hours. The pilot, Captain Michael Parsons, has flown reconnaissance missions for 7 months. He is skeptical. But orders are orders. First pass at 1,500 feet shows nothing obvious. He banks for a second pass at 1,200 feet. His observer suddenly taps his shoulder. "Wait. Those are not natural shadows." Parsons drops to 800 feet. Through breaks in the canopy, he sees it now. The unnatural geometry of human construction. Straight lines where nature makes curves. Camouflage netting slightly the wrong shade of green. And there, visible for just a moment, a soldier looking up at the aircraft. Firebase. Susan. This is Charlie Victor Yankee 26. Confirm positive target identification. Multiple structures camouflaged. Estimated 2 to 3 platoon present. Marking position now. Back at Firebase. Susan, the Tactical Operations Center, transforms into controlled chaos. Henderson immediately requests an airstrike from 7th Air Force. 4 F-4 Phantoms, armed with 500-pound bombs, depart Pleiku Air Base at 15:45 hours. At 16:07 hours, the first pair rolls in. The bombs fall. The first explosions are impressive. Then 8 seconds after the last bomb impacts the entire world seems to detonate. The secondary explosions are unlike anything the Americans have ever seen. A fireball erupts from the jungle, rising 2,000 feet into the air. The shockwave is visible, a rippling distortion that flattens vegetation in a perfect circle. More explosions follow. 43 tons of ammunition cooking off in sustained detonation lasting 7 minutes. When the smoke clears, aerial reconnaissance reveals a crater 200 meters across. The bunker complex has simply ceased to exist. Post-strike assessment estimates destruction of 43 tons of ammunition, 100 millimeter rockets, 82 millimeter mortar rounds, RPG warheads, AK-47 ammunition, hand grenades, enough ordnance to supply 3 enemy regiments for 6 months, and standing on the perimeter of Firebase. Susan, watching the distant jungle burn, is a 19-year-old cook from Queens who fell out of a truck and stumbled into history. But here is the thing. This devastating strike is only the beginning, because in exactly 9 days, the largest enemy offensive of the entire war will begin. The Tet Offensive. Thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters will launch coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Firebase Susan will face a battalion-level assault, and every single round of ammunition that just exploded in that jungle that was supposed to be used against American soldiers. What happens next will prove just how much one accidental hero changed the course of history. In Part 2, we will see exactly how Castelliano's discovery saved 300 lives during the bloodiest night Firebase Susan would ever face. In Part 1, we watched a 19-year-old cook named James Castelliano fall out of a supply truck, get lost in the Vietnamese jungle, and accidentally discover the largest enemy ammunition depot in the Central Highlands. His discovery triggered a devastating airstrike that destroyed 43 tons of enemy ordnance. But that was just the beginning, because in exactly 9 days, the Tet Offensive would begin, and everything Castelliano had just accomplished was about to be tested in ways nobody could have imagined. Intelligence officers knew something big was coming. Intercepted radio traffic suggested massive enemy buildup. Prisoners mentioned a general offensive. But when and where? The answer would arrive on January 31st, 1968, in a wave of fire and blood that would change the Vietnam War forever. Firebase Susan was directly in the crosshairs, and the ammunition that just exploded in that jungle crater, that was supposed to fuel the assault. This is where things get terrifying. The days following the airstrike were filled with an uneasy calm that made everyone nervous. Colonel Henderson submitted his after-action report through channels documenting the destruction of Firebase Echo and crediting Private First Class Castelliano with the initial discovery. The report worked its way up the chain of command to MACV headquarters in Saigon, where it landed on the desk of Major General Arthur Collins, Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. Collins read the report twice. Then he called Henderson directly. "Colonel, this cook of yours, you are telling me he stumbled into a regiment-sized ammunition cache by accident." "That is correct, sir. And you believed him." Everyone else dismissed his report. "Why did you authorize the reconnaissance flight?" Henderson paused before answering. "Because he was certain, sir. Absolutely certain. And in my experience, that kind of certainty either comes from training or from truth. He had no training, so I gambled on truth." Collins was not convinced. The destruction of Firebase Echo was impressive, but the method of discovery troubled him. Luck was not a strategy. Accident was not doctrine. If American forces started chasing every wild report from untrained personnel, they would waste resources on 1,000 false leads for every legitimate find. The general skepticism was not unfounded. In the previous 6 months, MACV had received over 400 reports of major enemy positions from non-intelligence personnel. Fewer than 12 had proven accurate. The false positive rate was destroying operational efficiency. Units were being diverted from planned missions to investigate phantom sightings. Morale was suffering as patrol after patrol returned empty-handed. Collins drafted a memorandum to all subordinate commands emphasizing the importance of proper intelligence validation procedures. Reports from non-qualified personnel were to be treated with extreme skepticism unless corroborated by trained observers. The memorandum arrived at Firebase Susan on January 25th. Henderson read it and understood the implication. Castelliano's success was being treated as an anomaly, not a model. The institutional machinery was grinding toward dismissal. But Henderson was not ready to let the matter drop. He had seen the crater. He had counted the secondary explosions. He had watched 43 tons of ammunition cook off in 7 minutes of sustained detonation. That was not luck. That was providence. And providence, in Henderson's experience, often repeated itself if you paid attention. He called Castelliano into his office on January 26th. The young cook stood at attention, still wearing his mess hall whites, clearly confused about why a full colonel wanted to speak with him again. At ease, Private. I have a question for you. Yes, sir. When you were in that jungle, lost and scared, what made you climb that tree? Castelliano thought about it. I needed to see where I was, sir. The jungle was too thick. I could not figure out direction, so I went up. And when you saw the enemy position, why did you watch for 7 minutes instead of immediately withdrawing? I wanted to be sure, sir. I wanted to count. I wanted to remember details, because I knew nobody would believe me otherwise. Henderson nodded slowly. That is exactly what I thought. You have good instincts, Private. Better than most trained reconnaissance personnel I have met. The problem is nobody at MACV cares about instincts. They care about credentials. And you have none. Castelliano said nothing. There was nothing to say. Henderson continued. But I have been in this army for 27 years, and I have learned that sometimes the best intelligence comes from the most unlikely sources. I want you to think about what you saw out there. Every detail, every observation, because I have a feeling we are going to need that information very soon. But the colonel had no idea just how soon that would be. 3 days later, on January 29th, Firebase Susan received a warning order. Intelligence indicated increased enemy activity throughout the Central Highlands. All units were to assume heightened alert status. Defensive positions were to be reinforced. Ammunition reserves were to be verified. Leave was cancelled. Henderson called his staff together for an emergency briefing. The S2 intelligence officer, Captain Byrne, presented the latest analysis. We are seeing movement patterns consistent with pre-offensive positioning, sir. Radio intercepts suggest coordinated activity across multiple provinces. Prisoner interrogations mention a general offensive, but timelines are vague. Some say days, some say weeks. Henderson studied the map. If you were planning a major assault on this fire base, where would you stage your ammunition? Byrne pointed to 3 locations. Here, here, and here, based on terrain analysis and previous enemy behavior patterns. He did not point to the location where Firebase Echo had been destroyed. That position was now a smoking crater. Henderson turned to Castelliano, who was standing at the back of the room, technically present only because he had been delivering coffee when the briefing started. Private, when you observed that ammunition depot, did you see any indication of other positions, secondary locations, supply routes? Castelliano stepped forward nervously. Sir, I saw trails. Multiple trails leading away from the bunker complex in different directions. At least 4 that I could see. The enemy was not just storing ammunition there, they were distributing it. To where I do not know, sir. But if Firebase Echo was a distribution hub, then there must be forward positions closer to us, smaller caches, positioned for quick access during an assault. The room fell silent. Byrne looked skeptical. With respect, sir, we are taking tactical analysis from a cook. Henderson held up his hand. We are taking tactical analysis from the only American who has ever actually seen an enemy ammunition depot in this sector. That counts for something in my book. He turned back to Castelliano. If you were the enemy, and you had just lost your main supply depot, what would you do? Castelliano thought carefully before answering. I would accelerate my timeline, sir. Use what I have before I lose more. Hit hard and fast while I still have ammunition to fight with. Henderson nodded grimly. That is exactly what I am afraid of. The attack came on January 31st, 1968, at 0300 hours. Firebase Susan was one of dozens of American positions hit simultaneously across South Vietnam, in what would become known as the Tet Offensive, the largest coordinated enemy operation of the entire war. Castelliano was asleep in his bunk when the first rockets hit. The explosion threw him to the floor. Sirens screamed. Flares burst overhead, turning the night into flickering orange daylight. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the perimeter, his mess hall training utterly useless, his brother's words echoing in his head. Over there, everybody is infantry. The enemy came in waves. NVA regulars supported by local Viet Cong. They hit the wire with Bangalore torpedoes and breached the perimeter in 2 locations. Fighting was hand-to-hand in some sectors. Castelliano found himself in a bunker with 3 infantrymen he had never met firing at shadows that moved through the smoke. He had never shot at a human being before. Now he was shooting at dozens. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat that felt like 6 years. Castelliano burned through all his ammunition twice resupplied from wounded soldiers who could no longer fight and kept shooting until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. When dawn finally broke, the enemy withdrew. Firebase Susan had held, but just barely. American casualties totaled 4 killed and 23 wounded. Enemy bodies counted outside the wire exceeded 200. Henderson walked the perimeter at first light, surveying the damage, counting the cost. He found Castelliano sitting against a sandbag wall covered in mud, and someone else's blood staring at nothing. Colonel approached and sat down beside him. "You did good, Private." Castelliano did not respond for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "Sir, something was wrong with their attack." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Wrong how their fire discipline. They were conserving ammunition. I watched them. They would fire 3 or 4 rounds, then stop. Wait. Fire again. That is not how you assault a fortified position. You lay down suppressive fire. You overwhelm the defenders. They were not overwhelming us. They were rationing." Henderson felt a chill run down his spine. "Firebase Echo. The ammunition we destroyed. You think that was supposed to supply this assault?" Castelliano nodded slowly. 43 tons, sir. Rockets, mortars, rifle ammunition. If they had that ordnance tonight, they would not have been rationing. They would have buried us." Henderson stood up and looked out at the battlefield. The crater-filled wire. The burning vehicles. The bodies being collected by grave registration teams. 4 Americans dead. 23 wounded. Those numbers were tragic, but they could have been catastrophic. Intelligence later confirmed what Castelliano suspected. Captured enemy documents revealed that the assault on Firebase Susan was supposed to be supported by sustained rocket and mortar barrages from Firebase Echo. The 66th NVA Regiment had been allocated 2,000 rounds of 120mm rockets for the initial bombardment alone. Those rockets were now scattered atoms in a jungle crater. The post-battle analysis was sobering. Division intelligence officers calculated that without the destruction of Firebase Echo, enemy forces would have possessed sufficient ammunition to sustain their assault for an additional 4 to 6 hours. Firebase Susan's defensive ammunition would have been exhausted within that time frame. Reinforcement was impossible during the initial hours of Tet, as American forces across Vietnam were simultaneously engaged. The firebase would almost certainly have been overrun. Estimated American casualties in that scenario exceeded 300 killed or captured. Major Harold Thompson, the division intelligence officer, wrote in his official report that the destruction of Firebase Echo directly degraded enemy combat effectiveness during the Tet Offensive. Estimated friendly casualties prevented by this single action totaled 300 killed or wounded. Firebase Susan would likely have been overrun had enemy forces possessed their full ammunition loadout. The report specifically credited Private First Class James Castelliano with providing the initial intelligence that made the airstrike possible. It recommended him for the Bronze Star with V device for valor. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the report also included a recommendation that would change American intelligence doctrine for the remainder of the war. Thompson wrote that the Castelliano incident demonstrated a critical vulnerability in current intelligence procedures. Actionable intelligence had nearly been dismissed because the source lacked formal training. The institutional bias toward credentialed observers had almost cost 300 American lives. Thompson recommended immediate revision of intelligence evaluation protocols. Information should be assessed based on content and corroboration, not source credentials. Non-combat personnel should receive basic reconnaissance training, and field commanders should be empowered to act on unverified intelligence when time constraints prevented formal validation. The recommendation went all the way to General Westmoreland himself. Within weeks, MACV issued new guidance emphasizing that actionable intelligence could come from any source, regardless of military occupational specialty. Training programs began incorporating case studies of unexpected observers. Intelligence officers were instructed to evaluate information based on content rather than source. Castelliano's method of climbing above the canopy for navigation became standard escape and evasion training. His patient observation technique became a teaching point in reconnaissance schools. The Bronze Star ceremony took place on February 14, 1968. General Westmoreland himself flew to Firebase Susan to pin the medal on Castelliano's chest. The citation praised his initiative, courage, and determination. Westmoreland shook his hand and said something about courage under fire. Castelliano stood at attention, said, "Thank you, sir," and returned to the mess hall to prep dinner. He never told anyone that when the ambush first happened, he had frozen completely. He never mentioned that he still woke up hearing Vietnamese voices in the darkness. He never explained that the Bronze Star recipient had cried in his bunk that night, overwhelmed by everything he had seen and done. War makes heroes out of ordinary people, but it does not make them any less human. And the ordinary people who become heroes often carry wounds that no medal can heal. But this is not the end of James Castelliano's story, because his accidental discovery had consequences that rippled far beyond Firebase Susan. The destruction of Firebase Echo disrupted enemy logistics across the entire Central Highlands. 3 NVA regiments found themselves critically short of ammunition during the crucial opening days of Tet. Operations that were supposed to overwhelm American positions instead stalled and failed. The 66th Regiment alone lost over 400 soldiers in attacks that should have succeeded but did not. And somewhere in the enemy chain of command, someone was asking questions. How did the Americans find Firebase Echo? The position had been operational for 11 months without detection. Aerial reconnaissance had passed over it dozens of times. Ground patrols had swept within 500 meters. Yet it remained hidden until January 17th. What changed? The answer, when enemy intelligence finally pieced it together, was disturbing. A single American soldier, lost and alone, had stumbled into their most secure logistics hub by pure accident. And instead of being captured or killed, he had escaped, reported his findings, and brought destruction from the sky within hours. The implications were terrifying. If one lost cook could compromise their most hidden position, what else might be vulnerable? In Part 3, we will see how the enemy responded to this intelligence failure, how they changed their tactics, relocated their supplies, and launched a desperate hunt for the American who had cost them so dearly. And we will see what happens when James Castelliano realizes that his war is far from over, because sometimes being a hero makes you a target. Let me recap what we have witnessed so far. A 19-year-old cook named James Castelliano fell out of a supply truck during an ambush, got lost in the Vietnamese jungle, and accidentally discovered Firebase Echo, the largest enemy ammunition depot in the Central Highlands. His discovery triggered an airstrike that destroyed 43 tons of ordnance. 9 days later, during the Tet Offensive firebase, Susan survived a battalion-level assault specifically because the enemy lacked the ammunition to sustain their attack. Intelligence estimated 300 American lives saved. Castelliano received the Bronze Star. New intelligence protocols were implemented across MACV, but the story does not end there. Because somewhere in the enemy chain of command, someone was asking dangerous questions. How did the Americans find Firebase Echo? The position had remained hidden for 11 months, and now the hunt was about to begin. Not for ammunition, not for territory, but for the American who had cost them everything. The destruction of Firebase Echo sent shockwaves through the North Vietnamese Army's Logistics Command. Colonel Nguyen Van Tran, the officer responsible for Central Highlands supply operations, received the news on January 18, 1968, less than 24 hours after the airstrike. His initial reaction was disbelief. Firebase Echo had been constructed with meticulous attention to concealment. Triple canopy coverage. Camouflage netting replaced every 3 weeks. Strict light and noise discipline. Movement only at night. American reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the area 17 times in the previous 6 months. Not once had they detected anything suspicious. Yet somehow, within hours of a single convoy ambush, American fighter bombers had appeared and destroyed everything. Tran demanded answers. His intelligence officers began piecing together the timeline. The ambush occurred at 0847 hours. An American observation aircraft appeared over Firebase Echo at approximately 1430 hours. The airstrike commenced at 1607 hours. Less than 8 hours from ambush to annihilation. That timeline was impossible unless someone on the ground had provided precise coordinates. Tran's conclusion was chilling. There had been an observer. Someone had seen Firebase Echo and survived long enough to report its location. The investigation intensified. Soldiers who participated in the convoy ambush were interrogated. They reported that one American vehicle had escaped, but several soldiers had fallen from the trucks during the chaos. Most were presumed killed or captured, but one body was never recovered. Tran studied the terrain maps. The ambush site was approximately 4 kilometers from Firebase Echo. An American soldier wounded or disoriented stumbling through unfamiliar jungle could theoretically have wandered close enough to observe the depot. But how did he escape? How did he navigate back to his firebase? How did he convince his commanders to launch an immediate reconnaissance mission? The answers eluded Tran, but the implications were clear. American intelligence capabilities had somehow improved dramatically. Whether through luck or design, they now possessed the ability to locate hidden positions with unprecedented speed. Every supply depot in the central Highlands was potentially compromised. Tran issued immediate orders. All major ammunition caches were to be relocated within 72 hours. New positions were to be established with even stricter concealment protocols. And most importantly, any American soldier captured alive was to be interrogated about reconnaissance methods before execution. The hunt for the Firebase Echo observer had begun. But Tran did not know his target's name. He did not know Castelliano was a cook with no reconnaissance training. He assumed he was hunting a highly trained intelligence operative. That assumption would prove both fortunate and dangerous. Back at Firebase, Susan Castelliano was unaware that he had become a person of interest to enemy intelligence. He returned to his mess hall duties, cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner for soldiers who now looked at him differently. The Bronze Star recipient. The cook who saved the Firebase. The accidental hero. He hated the attention. Every time someone slapped his back or bought him a beer, he felt like a fraud. He had not planned anything. He had not demonstrated tactical brilliance. He had fallen out of a truck, gotten lost, and climbed a tree. That was not heroism. That was survival instinct mixed with blind luck. The nightmares did not help. Every night he relived the ambush. The windshield shattering, the fall, the endless jungle, the Vietnamese voices. And now added to the rotation the Tet Offensive assault. Muzzle flashes in darkness. Bodies at the wire. The wet sound of bullets hitting flesh. He stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. His appetite disappeared. He lost 12 pounds in 2 weeks. The Firebase medic diagnosed combat fatigue and recommended evacuation to a rear area hospital. Castelliano refused. Leaving felt like admitting weakness. Besides, the mess hall needed him. Someone had to cook. Colonel Henderson noticed the deterioration. He called Castelliano into his office on February 20th. "Sit down, Private. You look like hell." "I am fine, sir." "No, you are not. And that is okay. Nobody is fine after what we went through. But I need to ask you something important. What do you remember about the trails you saw leading away from Firebase Echo?" Castelliano frowned. "I mentioned them in my initial report, sir. Multiple trails heading different directions. You said the depot was a distribution hub. I have been thinking about that. If Firebase Echo supplied multiple forward positions, those positions still exist. We destroyed the central cache, but the satellite caches remain. They are smaller, harder to find, but they are out there. Somewhere. I want you to work with Captain Byrne. Go over everything you remember, every detail. Help us find the rest." Castelliano felt his stomach clench. "You want me to go back out there, not into the jungle? Just the maps, the intelligence. Your memory might hold details you do not even realize are important." This is where things took an unexpected turn, because Castelliano's memory was about to prove more valuable than anyone imagined. Over the following weeks, Castelliano spent hours with Captain Byrne, poring over aerial photographs and topographic maps. He described everything he could remember about Firebase Echo: the bunker construction, the camouflage techniques, the trail patterns, the soldier movements. Byrne was initially skeptical that a cook could provide useful tactical intelligence, but Castelliano's observations were remarkably detailed. He remembered that the trails heading northeast were wider and more worn than those heading southwest, suggesting heavier traffic toward Firebase Susan. He remembered that the soldiers unloading crates worked in teams of 4 with specific spacing that suggested standard NVA logistics doctrine. He remembered that the camouflage netting had a distinctive weave pattern that differed from vegetation in subtle but identifiable ways. Byrne began cross-referencing these observations with aerial photography of other suspected enemy positions. On March 3rd, he found something: a section of jungle, 12 kilometers northwest of Firebase. Susan showed the same camouflage weave pattern Castelliano had described. The netting was nearly invisible from directly overhead, but at certain angles, the weave created a geometric regularity that natural vegetation lacked. Byrne requested a reconnaissance flight. The pilot confirmed multiple structures beneath the canopy. Firebase Echo 2, as it was designated, contained an estimated 15 tons of ammunition. The airstrike destroyed it on March 5th. But the enemy was adapting. Colonel Tran had anticipated that the Americans would search for additional depots, using whatever method had revealed Firebase Echo. He ordered his units to abandon fixed positions entirely and transition to mobile supply operations. Ammunition would be moved constantly, never remaining in one location for more than 48 hours. The logistical burden was enormous, but it made targeting nearly impossible. American reconnaissance flights increased dramatically throughout March 1968, but success rates plummeted. Firebase Echo 2 was the last major cache discovered using Castelliano's observational methods. The enemy had learned. They had evolved, and they were still hunting for the American who had started it all. The first indication that Castelliano was personally targeted came on March 15th. A captured NVA soldier during interrogation mentioned that his unit had been briefed about an American intelligence operative operating in the Firebase Susan sector. The operative was described as highly trained, possibly special forces responsible for the destruction of multiple supply depots. Standing orders were to capture this individual alive for interrogation. When Henderson heard this report, he immediately understood the danger. The enemy thought they were hunting a trained intelligence officer. They did not know their target was a 19-year-old cook who had never received reconnaissance training in his life. That anonymity was the only thing keeping Castelliano safe. Henderson made a decision. He called Castelliano into his office and explained the situation. "Private, I am transferring you out of Firebase Susan, effective immediately." "What, why?" "Because the enemy is looking for you. They do not know who you are, but they are looking, and if they figure it out, you become a high-value target. I am sending you to Camran Bay, rear area, safe." Castelliano felt a strange mixture of relief and shame. Running away felt wrong, even if it made tactical sense. "Sir, I can still contribute here. The intelligence work with Captain Byrne. Captain Byrne has everything he needs. Your safety is more important than your cooking." Castelliano wanted to argue, but Henderson's expression made clear the decision was final. He packed his gear that afternoon and boarded a helicopter at 1600 hours. As Firebase Susan shrank beneath him, he felt something he had not expected. Loss. The firebase had nearly killed him. It had given him nightmares. It had turned him into someone he did not recognize. But it had also given him purpose. And now that purpose was gone. Cam Ranh Bay was everything Firebase Susan was not. Clean, organized, safe. The mess hall was a permanent structure with actual refrigeration and fresh vegetables. Castelliano's new assignment was supervising breakfast operations for a logistics battalion. No patrols, no perimeter duty, no incoming rockets, just eggs and coffee and soldiers who had never heard of Firebase Echo. He should have been grateful. Instead, he felt hollow. The nightmares continued. The memories did not fade. He wrote letters home that said everything was fine, knowing his father would read between the lines and worry anyway. He counted the days until his rotation ended. 127 days remaining, then 126, then 125. Each day identical to the last. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The news reached Cam Ranh Bay via Armed Forces radio. Castelliano listened to the reports with the strange detachment that had become his default emotional state. The world was falling apart. Vietnam, America, everything. And he was cooking eggs. But the story was not over. Because back at Firebase, Susan Captain Byrne had continued analyzing Castelliano's observations. And on April 12th, he made a breakthrough that would change everything. Byrne had been studying the trail patterns Castelliano described specifically, the observation that northeastern trails showed heavier wear than southwestern ones. If Firebase Echo was a distribution hub, the wear patterns indicated primary supply routes. Following those routes backward toward their origin might reveal the source. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. Byrne overlaid Castelliano's observations with signals, intelligence prisoner interrogations, and aerial photography. A pattern emerged. Enemy supplies entering the central highlands followed predictable corridors, funneling through specific terrain features before dispersing to forward positions. Firebase Echo had been located at a critical junction point. There were likely other junction points along the same corridor. On April 15th, Byrne presented his analysis to Colonel Henderson. "Sir, I think we can predict where the enemy will establish new supply depots. Not find existing ones, but anticipate where they will build future ones based on terrain and traffic patterns." Henderson studied the map. "You are talking about ambush positions. Pre-positioning forces along likely supply routes." "Yes, sir. Instead of searching for needles in haystacks, we wait at the haystack and catch them bringing in new needles." It was a fundamental shift in strategy. Reactive to proactive. Searching to ambushing. The concept was approved within 48 hours. Operation Cassandra, named for the Greek prophet nobody believed, launched on April 20th, 1968. 3 long-range reconnaissance patrols were inserted along predicted supply corridors, identified using Byrne's analysis. Within 72 hours, all 3 teams reported enemy activity. One team observed a supply convoy of 40 porters carrying ammunition toward a previously unknown position. They called in artillery that killed an estimated 25 enemy soldiers and destroyed the entire shipment. Another team discovered a trail junction being prepared for construction, apparently a new distribution hub. Airstrikes caught the enemy in the open, killing over 30 and preventing the depot from ever becoming operational. The third team ambushed a high-value target, a North Vietnamese logistics officer carrying documents that revealed the entire Central Highlands supply network. The intelligence windfall was enormous. Over the following months, Operation Cassandra expanded across multiple sectors. The methodology spread. Other units adopted similar predictive approaches based on terrain analysis and traffic pattern observation. Enemy logistics became increasingly disrupted. Supply convoys that once moved with impunity now faced ambushes at every turn. Colonel Tran's mobile supply strategy, designed to evade fixed position discovery, proved vulnerable to route prediction. By June 1968, MACV estimated that enemy logistics efficiency in the Central Highlands had decreased by 34% compared to pre-Tet levels. The impact rippled outward. American casualties in the region dropped 28% between April and August 1968. Enemy casualties increased correspondingly. Firebase Susan, which had suffered 73 attacks between November 1967 and January 1968, experienced only 31 attacks between February and July 1968. The intensity of those attacks also decreased as ammunition shortages forced the enemy into conservation rather than aggression. None of this would have happened without a cook who fell out of a truck. Castelliano's observations, seemingly random details noticed by a terrified teenager trying to survive, had provided the foundation for an entirely new approach to intelligence operations. His descriptions of trail wear patterns, camouflage techniques, and logistics procedures had enabled Byrne to develop predictive models that transformed American strategy in the Central Highlands. The irony was profound. Castelliano had no idea. Stuck in Camron Bay, cooking eggs for soldiers who had never seen combat, he had no visibility into Operation Cassandra or its results. He did not know that his observations were saving lives every week. He did not know that his accidental intelligence had become the basis for a revolutionary tactical approach. He only knew that he was 19 years old, far from home, and counting days until he could leave this war behind forever. On July 15, 1968, Castelliano received orders. He was being transferred again, this time to MACV headquarters in Saigon. The orders did not explain why. When he arrived, he was escorted to an office where a full colonel was waiting. "Sit down, Private. I am Colonel Marcus Webb, Intelligence Liaison. I have been wanting to meet you for some time." Castelliano sat confused and nervous. "Sir, you probably do not know this, but your observations from Firebase Echo have had significant operational impact. Captain Byrne's analysis based on your descriptions has informed operations across multiple sectors. Enemy logistics have been substantially degraded. I wanted to thank you personally." Castelliano did not know what to say. "I just told them what I saw, sir." "Yes, and what you saw has saved a lot of lives. More than you know." Webb handed him a folder. Inside was a summary of Operation Cassandra results. Castelliano read the numbers with growing disbelief. 34% reduction in enemy logistics efficiency. 28% decrease in American casualties. Hundreds of enemy killed. Tons of ammunition destroyed. All traced back to analysis derived from his observations. He looked up at Webb. "I did not know any of this." "Of course not. That is how intelligence works. The person who provides the information rarely sees the result. But I thought you deserved to know. Your contribution has been extraordinary." But here is where the story takes its final turn. Because Colonel Webb had not summoned Castelliano just to deliver thanks. He had another purpose entirely. "Private, your rotation ends in 67 days. You will return to the United States, receive your discharge, and resume civilian life. That is the normal course of events. However, I am authorized to offer you an alternative." Castelliano felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of alternative?" "We are establishing a new intelligence training program, teaching non-traditional observation techniques to personnel across all military occupational specialties. We want people who are not trained intelligence officers to understand how to observe, remember, and report. Your experience demonstrates that valuable intelligence can come from unexpected sources. We want you to help teach that lesson. You want me to become an instructor. We want you to share your experience. How you observed the depot. How you remembered details. How you navigated back. Your story could help other soldiers survive similar situations." Castelliano thought about his father's restaurant, his brother's nightmares, the eggs he had been cooking for months, the hollow feeling that never quite went away. He thought about the 300 lives saved at Firebase Susan, the soldiers who went home to their families because he climbed a tree and paid attention. He thought about purpose. What happens to James Castelliano next? Does he go home and try to forget? Or does he stay and try to make a difference? In Part 4, we will discover the choice he made and the legacy he left behind. A legacy that extends far beyond Vietnam, far beyond the military, and into lessons that remain relevant to this very day. Because sometimes the most important battles are not fought with weapons. They are fought with memory. And memory, as James Castelliano proved, can change everything. Let me take you back to where this incredible journey began. A 19-year-old cook named James Castelliano fell out of a supply truck during an ambush in the Vietnamese jungle. Lost and terrified, he stumbled upon Firebase Echo, the largest enemy ammunition depot in the Central Highlands. His discovery triggered an airstrike that destroyed 43 tons of ordnance. 9 days later, his accidental intelligence saved Firebase Susan during the Tet Offensive, preventing an estimated 300 American deaths. His observations became the foundation for Operation Cassandra, a revolutionary approach to predictive intelligence that reduced American casualties by 28% across the region. From a cook who could barely qualify with his rifle to a Bronze Star recipient whose methods transformed military doctrine. But here is the question that remains unanswered. What happened to James Castelliano after the war ended? What became of the accidental hero who wanted nothing more than to go home and cook in his father's restaurant? This story has one final chapter, and it contains a twist that nobody expected. Because sometimes the greatest legacy is not the one you planned. Colonel Webb's offer hung in the air of that Saigon office. Stay and teach. Help other soldiers learn from his experience. Become part of something larger than himself. Castelliano had 67 days remaining on his rotation. He could go home, forget everything, and spend the rest of his life making pasta at Rosario's. Or he could extend his tour and try to make a difference. He thought about it for 3 days. He wrote a letter to his father that he never sent. He walked the streets of Saigon at night, watching the city that seemed simultaneously at war and at peace. He thought about the soldiers at Firebase Susan, who went home because he climbed a tree. He thought about the soldiers who might go home in the future if he shared what he learned. On the 4th day, he told Webb, "No. I appreciate the offer, sir, but I need to go home. I need to remember who I was before all this." Webb nodded, unsurprised but disappointed. "The offer remains open private, if you change your mind." Castelliano never changed his mind. He rotated home in July 1968, received his honorable discharge at Oakland Army Base, and took a Greyhound bus back to Queens. His father met him at the Port Authority terminal. They embraced without words. Rosario Castelliano had aged 10 years in the 7 months his son was gone. That night they sat in the empty restaurant after closing, drinking wine and not talking about Vietnam. Castelliano returned to work at Rosario's within a week. He found comfort in the familiar rhythms. Prep at 6 a.m., lunch service, dinner rush, cleanup, sleep, repeat. The kitchen was small enough to feel safe, loud enough to drown out memory. He developed a reputation for arriving first and leaving last. He volunteered for every shift. He avoided idle time like it was enemy fire. Because idle time meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant hearing Vietnamese voices in the darkness. He never spoke about his Bronze Star. He stored the medal in a shoebox under his bed beneath old baseball cards and letters from high school friends. When customers occasionally recognized his name from a newspaper article that had briefly mentioned his story, he changed the subject. When his brother Marco tried to talk about their shared experience of war, Castelliano walked away. He built walls around his memories and defended them fiercely. For 27 years, those walls held. He married Maria Conti in 1972. They had 3 children. He took over the restaurant when his father retired in 1985. He coached Little League. He attended church. He lived a life that looked from the outside completely normal. But the nightmares never stopped. The hypervigilance never faded. The sound of a car backfiring could send him to his knees. He never told anyone. He never sought help. In 1968, there was no vocabulary for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. There was only weakness, and James Castelliano refused to be weak. The breakthrough came in 1995 when a military historian named Dr. Robert Chen contacted him. Chen was researching the Tet Offensive for a book about intelligence failures and successes. He had found Castelliano's name in declassified documents and wanted to interview him. Castelliano's first instinct was to refuse. But something in Chen's letter resonated. The historian was not interested in heroism or medals. He was interested in understanding how a cook with no training had accomplished what trained intelligence officers could not. Castelliano agreed to one phone conversation. That conversation lasted 4 hours. For the first time in 27 years, Castelliano talked about Firebase Echo, about the ambush, about climbing the tree, about the terror and the luck and the guilt of surviving when others did not. Chen listened without judgment. When Castelliano finished, the historian said something that changed everything. "You know the methods you described, the observation techniques, the terrain analysis, they became standard doctrine. They are still teaching your approach at intelligence schools today." Castelliano was silent for a long moment. "I did not know that. Most people do not. But your accidental discovery led to systematic changes in how the military gathers and evaluates intelligence. You did not just save 300 lives at Firebase Susan. You helped save thousands of lives in every conflict since." But the true legacy of James Castelliano extended far beyond his personal observations. It reached into the fundamental structure of military intelligence doctrine. Captain Burns' analysis, built on Castelliano's descriptions, had demonstrated something revolutionary. Valuable tactical intelligence could come from any source, regardless of training or credentials. The traditional model assumed that only trained observers could provide reliable information. Castelliano proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Within months of Operation Cassandra's success, MACV issued formal guidance requiring commanders to evaluate intelligence based on content rather than source. Training programs were revised to teach basic observation skills to all military personnel, not just intelligence specialists. The concept spread beyond Vietnam. By 1975, the methodology had been incorporated into NATO training doctrine. By 1985, it had influenced intelligence gathering approaches in conflicts from the Falklands to Grenada. By 2001, the principles Castelliano accidentally demonstrated were being taught to every soldier deploying to Afghanistan and Iraq. The specific techniques evolved. Technology advanced. Satellites and drones replaced observation aircraft. Digital analysis replaced paper maps. But the core insight remained unchanged. Pay attention to details. Remember what you observe. Report, even if you doubt your qualifications. Trust that someone else might see patterns you cannot. Military historians estimate that the doctrinal changes influenced by the Firebase Echo incident have contributed to improved intelligence effectiveness across dozens of conflicts over 5 decades. Precise casualty figures are impossible to calculate, but conservative estimates suggest that the shift toward source-neutral intelligence evaluation has saved thousands of lives since 1968. The approach has spread beyond military applications. Law enforcement agencies adopted similar principles in the 1980s. Corporate security consultants teach comparable observation methods today. The underlying philosophy that expertise is not limited to credentialed experts has become a foundational concept in fields ranging from intelligence analysis to crowdsourced journalism. None of this was planned. None of this was predictable. A terrified teenager fell out of a truck, climbed a tree, and accidentally triggered a revolution in how institutions gather and evaluate information. The military academies that now teach these principles rarely mention Castelliano by name. The training manuals that incorporate his methods do not credit their origin. His contribution has become so fundamental that it has become invisible, woven into the fabric of doctrine so completely that its source is forgotten. But the legacy endures. Every time a soldier reports something unusual, every time a commander takes seriously information from an unexpected source, every time an institution chooses to evaluate ideas based on merit rather than origin, the echo of Firebase. Echo resonates. The lessons of Castelliano's story extend far beyond military intelligence. They speak to fundamental truths about innovation institutions and human potential. First, there is the lesson about creativity and unexpected sources. The military establishment of 1968 assumed that valuable reconnaissance could only come from trained observers. They had invested millions of dollars in specialized units, advanced equipment, and extensive training programs. Yet the most significant intelligence breakthrough in the Central Highlands came from a cook who had never learned land navigation. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, not aeronautical engineers. Eli Whitney was a tutor, not a manufacturing expert. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. The lesson is not that expertise is worthless. The lesson is that expertise can emerge from unexpected places and institutions that dismiss ideas based on their source rather than their content, often miss transformative opportunities. Second, there is the lesson about institutional resistance. Captain Byrne initially dismissed Castelliano's report. Major General Collins wrote memoranda emphasizing proper credentials. The system was designed to filter out unqualified voices, and it nearly filtered out the most important intelligence of the entire campaign. This institutional antibody response to unexpected innovation appears everywhere. Kodak engineers invented digital photography and were ignored by management. Xerox researchers developed the graphical user interface and watched competitors commercialize it. Military history is filled with examples of breakthrough ideas rejected because they came from the wrong person or challenged established doctrine. The lesson is not that institutions are inherently corrupt or stupid. The lesson is that institutional filters designed to maintain quality and consistency can also block genuine innovation. Awareness of this tendency is the first step toward addressing it. Third, there is the lesson about courage in the face of skepticism. Castelliano insisted on speaking to the intelligence officer even after the sergeant of the guard dismissed him. He pointed to the map even after Captain Byrne questioned his qualifications. He maintained his certainty even when everyone in the room doubted him. That persistence, that willingness to stand behind an unpopular position, made all the difference. History is filled with parallel examples. Ignaz Semmelweis insisted that doctors wash their hands despite ridicule from the medical establishment. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift and was mocked for decades before plate tectonics proved him right. Billy Mitchell advocated for air power and was court-martialed for his persistence. These individuals shared a common trait. They trusted their observations over institutional skepticism. They paid professional costs for their certainty, and they were eventually vindicated often after it was too late for them to see it. Castelliano was luckier than most. Colonel Henderson listened. The reconnaissance flight was authorized. The airstrike succeeded. But the lesson remains. Certainty born from direct observation deserves respect even when it challenges conventional wisdom. And there is one final detail that most people do not know. A twist that remained classified for decades and only emerged when Dr. Chen published his research in 2003. The captured documents from Operation Cassandra, the ones recovered from the North Vietnamese logistics officer, contained more than supply route information. They contained a list, a target list of American personnel believed responsible for major intelligence breakthroughs. The list included several names that remained classified. But one name had been partially decoded by NVA intelligence. Castelliano. The enemy had not figured out his first name, his rank, or his unit. They knew only that someone named Castelliano had been involved in the destruction of Firebase Echo. They had been actively hunting him, The list indicated that a special operations team had been assigned to locate and eliminate this intelligence operative believed to be operating in the firebase Susan sector. Colonel Henderson's decision to transfer Castelliano to Cam Ranh Bay had not just been cautious, it had almost certainly saved his life. The NVA team arrived in the firebase Susan area approximately 3 weeks after Castelliano departed. They spent 2 months searching for an intelligence officer who was never there. They eventually concluded that Castelliano had been evacuated or killed, and the hunt was abandoned. Castelliano learned this in 2003, when Chen shared the declassified documents with him. He sat in his restaurant kitchen, now run by his oldest son, reading the translated Vietnamese text. His hands trembled. For 35 years, he had not known how close death had come. He had not known that his transfer was anything more than administrative convenience. He had not known that enemy special forces had been specifically hunting the cook who ruined their offensive. When his son asked what was wrong, Castelliano could only shake his head. Nothing, just old memories. But that night, for the first time since 1968, he took the Bronze Star out of the shoebox. He looked at it for a long time. Then he called his brother Marco. "I think I am ready to talk now." James Paul Castelliano died on March 15, 2011, at age 62. Heart failure, the doctors said. The funeral was held at St. Joseph's Church in Astoria, 3 blocks from the restaurant where he had spent most of his life. 200 people attended. Neighbors, customers, family. Friends who had known him for decades without ever learning what he had done in Vietnam. But 3 other men attended as well. They wore VFW uniforms and sat in the back row. They had been at Firebase Susan during Tet. They had survived because a cook climbed a tree. After the service, they approached the family. One of them left a handwritten note in the memorial book. "Because of you, we came home. Thank you." The Bronze Star is now displayed at the 4th Infantry Division Museum at Fort Carson, Colorado. A placard beside it describes Castelliano as an unlikely hero who proved that courage comes in many forms. The citation mentions initiative, determination, and the destruction of a major enemy logistics facility. It does not mention the tree he climbed, or the terror he felt, or the 27 years of nightmares that followed him home. It does not mention that the greatest intelligence breakthrough of the Central Highlands campaign came from a teenager whose only training was making scrambled eggs for 350 soldiers. It does not mention that military doctrine used in conflicts around the world today traces its philosophical origins to observations made by a lost cook in January 1968. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. From a 19-year-old mess hall cook who fell out of a truck to an accidental discovery that saved 300 lives and transformed military intelligence doctrine for generations. James Castelliano never sought heroism. He never asked for recognition. He never believed he deserved the Bronze Star pinned on his chest. He just did what anyone would do. He observed. He remembered. He reported. And he insisted on being heard when everyone doubted him. In the end, that is what heroism looks like. Not the dramatic charges of Hollywood movies. Not the superhuman feats of comic books. Just ordinary people doing what needs to be done even when they are terrified, even when they doubt themselves, even when the institutions around them say they are not qualified. The jungle did not care what Castelliano's job description said. And neither did history. If you have made it this far, you have spent over an hour learning about a man that history nearly forgot. A cook who became an intelligence asset. A teenager who outperformed trained reconnaissance teams. An accidental hero whose methods are still saving lives today. There are hundreds of stories like this from every war in history. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things when circumstance demanded it. People whose contributions were classified, forgotten, or never recorded at all. If you know a story like this, share it in the comments. If you want to discover more hidden history, subscribe to this channel. Because the past is filled with secrets waiting to be told. And sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. James Castelliano taught us that courage does not require training, that intelligence does not require credentials, that one person in the right place at the right time can change everything. And that is not just military history. That is the truth about human potential. Remember it.